Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special episode of Exploring A Course in Miracles. I'm Emily Bennington, and it is my great pleasure to be here today with Katherine Woodward Thomas, New York Times bestselling author of Conscious Uncoupling and Calling in the One. Katherine is also a licensed marriage and family therapist and a teacher to students all around the world who want to learn more about ending or beginning a significant relationship with love at the center. And I should know, because I am one of those students, Katherine, the reason I am such a big fan of your work is because I have lived both of your books. You don't know it, but you have been with me through my own conscious uncoupling when I got divorced in 2018. And you've been with me on the journey to calling in the one. As you can imagine, this whole process has been quite a steep emotional arc. And as a student of A Course in Miracles, I have to say, as I was telling you before we hit record, that outside of the course, your work helped me the most during this time in my life, and it's the most course-like process that I have seen. What draws students to the course, or at least what drew me to the course, is that I feel like it's a path that leads us to being good people who are purely loving. It speaks of relationships ending, but ending with love. And it's calling us to be the kind of egoless presence that can attract and grow what the Course calls a holy relationship, which doesn't have to be romantic, but very often is. And so when I read your work, I was just so moved by the ways in which you were essentially saying you can love your way through the breakup of a significant relationship, and you can love your way into a new one. You're not teaching tips and tricks. You are teaching a new way of being in the world. And that's why I wanted to talk to you today, because this is what the course is asking us to do as well. And it's great when there's an overlap on this of ideas on this level. And so I know from reading your work that you are obviously a very spiritual student. That comes through in your writing. And I'm just curious, as we get started here, have you been a student of the course, or has the course inspired your work at all?
Oh, beautiful. I don't usually get to talk about this, but before I wrote Calling in the One, which is my first book, and I wrote it, it first came out in 2004. I've since rewritten it last year. This is actually the new cover, is up here. That's the old version that you showed. But I modeled it after several books. One was the 12 and 12 in Alcoholics Anonymous, because if you're in the 12-step program, which I was in for years with compulsive overeating, so I did outgrow that addiction and was able to, move on to other structures of well-being. But when I was there, I loved reading the 12 and 12 because it was so alive every time I read it. So that aliveness of the text really stayed with me. The other was Julia Cameron's book about creativity, The Artist's Way, which was written in a way you could do it in community with other people, which Calling in the One is written that way too. And A Course in Miracles, in terms of the lesson a day and then the practice that you take out and you become in the world. And before that, for several years, I used to go to, I think Marianne Williamson came out with her book, A Return to Love, in 94. Was that 94? 92. So I used to go to lectures with Marianne in 1991. So that's where I first heard about the course. And of course, there was just a handful of us that would go every Tuesday night. Maybe 75 people knew who Marianne was.
And times have changed.
And we're just riveted by her. So she was a big part of my orientation to the work. And yet I've been a student of all sorts of spiritual paths that are definitely about centered on transformation, centered on expanding one's capacity to love and be loved, centered on a lived experience of divine energy, really starting from the age of 14, when I had what I call a spiritual awakening, which is not that I became enlightened. It's just that I prayed a prayer and suddenly there was a rush of energy that moved through my body that shocked me because I didn't know such things existed. And from that moment forward, I knew that there was some force and field of life that was benevolent, that was kind, that was good, and that loved myself and all beings. And I started to have transcendent experiences. I remember walking to school when I was a teenager. A lot happens for us all when we're teenagers that have to do with life purpose. But I remember one incident in particular where I was walking to school and I started to feel like I was kind of walking on air a little bit. And I woke up to what it might feel like to have an experience where everyone is awake to the field of relatedness between us. And in that moment, it was so beautiful that I devoted my life to that. Now, I had a lot of personal healing to do, and that took me into a deep, deep, deep dive into, number one, addiction. So I first got, quite sick with addiction. And then number two, recovery from addiction, which was quite a few years, but therapy, metaphysics, transformational technologies, A Course in Miracles. So there's many things that I was doing. But I'm really honored to hear how much the work that I was presenting back then and am presenting now is congruent with this very holy book. It's it's a book that was created before its time, and it's kind of a foreshadowing, I think, of what's to come in human consciousness. So I'm just grateful to be with you talking about it.
Yeah, and it's all too needed for the healing of the world that is desperately needed today. So we only have an hour here, and I'm hoping that we can cover both topics, ending a relationship and calling in a new one. I'd like to start with conscious uncoupling and just zoom out a bit. The idea that breaking up doesn't have to be this nasty, toxic thing shouldn't have been a revolutionary concept, but for whatever reason it was. And your work was the first that I know of to substantially shift the conversation to a place where we realize that there's a better way to go through the process of breaking up that will minimize damage for everyone. And sometimes relationships can just completely implode, but sometimes they just fizzle. And I think a lot of people can relate to the ending of your first marriage to Mark. And so I just wanted to begin by reading an excerpt of the book, and then I'll ask you a question about it. So I can certainly relate to what you write here. You say, there are a million little ways that a marriage grows apart, most too mundane to mention. Yet what happened to Mark and me in a nutshell is that I changed. And I mean radically, in many ways, quite unfairly changed. It's kind of an occupational hazard, the downside of being a teacher of growth and transformation. My husband didn't cheat on me. He didn't abuse me. He was not an alcoholic or a chronic gambler. Yet as the years went by, the core values by which we lived grew further and further apart. So, Katherine, sometimes we know that a relationship is meant to end, but we don't know where to start or how to end it. What advice would you give to someone who really feels ready to end a relationship, but maybe they want to keep the process harmonious, but maybe the other person isn't ready to let go?
Yeah, which is, by the way, I think I felt very blessed when Gwyneth popped conscious uncoupling into the lexicon, but I also think that it created a bit of a myth where people think that conscious uncoupling is for two people who want to do this harmoniously well together. But usually the truth is that there's one person who wants to do it. So I originally created conscious uncoupling for one person to be able to do and to take the lead on how this is going to go, to be able to stay out of reactivity, out of fear, to de-escalate any potential battles, to find a way to do this harmonious, all the while they're struggling with their own disappointments, their own levels of fear that are going on. It's definitely, for many people, one of the most traumatic things that they'll ever go through. And I think that most of us, particularly those of us in this community, would aspire to a good breakup, an amicable ending to a relationship. But there's ways that we are hardwired as human beings that predispose us to go to war. And I think it's nature's way of keeping us connected and bonded, because I say we go from soulmate to soul hate very easily. And soul hate is actually where, hate is not the opposite of love. Hate is like the shadow side of love. We're just as engaged as we were before. That's when you're cyber stalking, you're thinking, you're obsessing, you're ruminating, you're dreaming or fantasizing about revenge. You're anything but indifferent. Indifference is actually the opposite of love. And where we want to get to with conscious completion is almost a neutrality about the disappointments that we suffered, where everything is just kind of so midwifed to, and all the mistakes made have been kind of midwifed into a place of perspective, wisdom, expansion of compassion, a deepening of our capacity to love and be loved. So if we shortcut that by trying to sever a relationship, or we get stuck in the quicksand of resentment or blame and shame, even if we're blaming and shaming ourselves, we don't actually get to the other side of it. So, a lot of us, we don't really know how to do this well because of our kind of biological predisposition to feel like we are going to go to war. We're going to die. We need to fight for our lives here. We'll pull on people to take our side, which is a form of, really, it's a form of it's a social attack on other people, on the person that we're breaking up with, if we bring everyone to our side of things and start bad-mouthing people. So there's all sorts of primitive parts of us that get engaged. I tell people, look, if you wandered away from your tribe 1,000 years ago, you'd probably die. So it's almost like a hybrid from those days where we haven't yet evolved, because as much as we all love the happily ever after myth, the truth is it's only 400 years old, which is like a hiccup on the human timeline. It's a very new conversation. And it was created when the lifespan was less than 40, and there was no mobility. You pretty much, you were born into one village and one occupation and one economic strategy, and that's your whole life. You just stayed there. So we live in a very different time than when that myth was created, and very few of us are slated to meet one person, mate with that person, and live with that person forever. So conscious uncoupling is an offering that's really about helping us to really kind of catch up to the culture that we're living in. And so many of us do care about being loving people, ethical people. We certainly don't want to mess our children up. And we want to learn our lessons so that the next time we love, we can love deeper and with more confidence. It's also to be noted that while in America anyway, the statistic at the 50% divorce statistic is really about 45% of first marriages end in divorce, over 60% of second marriages, and over 70% of third marriages do. So if we do not learn our lessons, we'll probably repeat those same mistakes again. And this time we know we can leave and we're not going to die. So we're more ready to go through that experience again. So that's the offering of conscious uncoupling.
What is that? What do these marriage statistics say about our ability to get along with each other? What I love about one of the origins of the course, is that it's a book that came out of a search for a better way for two people to get along, to cooperate instead of compete, and to find harmony in the department wherein they work. And so there's this baseline of cooperation and love at the heart of the course. And that's one of the overlaps that I see obviously in your work as well, is that we can do this, we can change the form of a relationship, but let's talk about how to do this in a new way. And you were mentioning some of the ways in which culture has changed. I didn't even realize until I read Conscious Uncoupling that you couldn't even get a divorce maybe before the 70s without having some kind of reason that related to abuse, like irreconcilable differences, like we just don't get along, wasn't a thing.
Right.
And so we're just set up to make separation a battle, but it doesn't have to be that way.
Right. And it's important to know that that's kind of the roots of the law that we have now. So you had family courts come in once once no fault divorce was introduced. I think it was in the late 60s, early 70s. I'd have to look it up again. It's been a while since I did that research. But Ronald Reagan actually began the conversation in California. He said once that was the worst thing he ever did because it unleashed the divorce revolution in America.
I think
And
Reaganomics was the worst thing he ever
yeah,
did.
thank you very much. So it unleashed this whole, antagonistic going to war. And of course, family courts were originally created to kind of, expedite that process. And then it became more and more complex. So originally, the family court book was that. Now it's like this. And of course, you need these very high priced attorneys. So unfortunately, still, one of the first things we do when we realize we're getting a divorce is call an attorney. And if you haven't worked out your own kind of primitive fear, reactivity, all of the huge, overwhelming tidal waves of emotions that are moving through you, you're very, very vulnerable to getting caught up in that system. And this is where people, go through their child's college fund without a
Yeah.
thought, really.
Well, I just want to flip the conversation a bit from where we're trying to start the process of conscious and complete with someone else to what happens when someone is breaking up with us. So what advice would you give to someone who is listening if they are the ones who want to stay in a relationship, but the other person wants to go? What is the conscious uncoupling methodology for that?
Well, and in a way, that's really who I wrote the book for, because I just recognized that that's really one of the hardest things that someone will ever need to go through. That shift from being the person who was chosen to now the one who's no longer wanted and rejected is a horrifying experience. I think one of the dangers is what we psychologists people call prolonged grief or complicated grief. And that's when the grief doesn't mitigate over time, really. It doesn't really lessen. I mean, you kind of go from the shock, the acute shock of it, to you can function again, you can work again, but
You can call
maybe
in another one.
you can even get into another relationship, but there's a part of you that's kind of frozen inside and you're not really over it. Part of you that's always kind of watching, waiting, would that person ever come back? Or you just can't get rid of the anger and the bitterness at the lies that were told or the betrayal of it. So the prolonged grief, though, what I have found is that there is, of course, grief that all of us are going to feel at the end of a relationship. We all have, hopes for a different kind of future, a different kind of outcome. And it's sad to lose a relationship with someone that you've loved. But that grief will go through the normal stages of, processing through your psyche, the 5 stages of grief that David Kessler and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross have noted for us. David just added a 6th stage of grief called meaning, how to make empowered meaning of the loss, which is about growth. Where prolonged grief comes in is when the rejection lodges as evidence for what I call your source fracture story, which is the original break in your heart. That's the traumatized self of, when you were younger and somehow you were neglected and you made it mean that you were not good enough, you were not worthy, you were not lovable. that you are not safe in relationship. And in a breakup situation where somebody is in rejecting us, we will very often default into that old meaning. And we can stay in that meaning for years, actually, particularly when we think of the other person, particularly if the other person is has got a whole story about us, about what an awful person we are. We're a narcissist, we're, trouble, we're worthless, or whatever. We're kind of left with the residue of the meaning of that. And that's where I think we kind of don't get over it. So in the conscious uncoupling process, there's there's 5 steps total, but the first 3 are all your own internal work. And the first thing that I encourage people to do, because we have to start where we are, is learn how to hold and contain all of your overwhelming emotions from a center that is capable of holding all of it with love. It's like you're able to hold yourself in a field of love, almost like you imagine if there were angels surrounding you, they might hold you having this experience. And you can do that in large part. You can begin to de-escalate the intensity of these overwhelming feelings through an exercise that psychologists might call affect labeling, which is really this very simple way of just turning towards yourself and saying, sweetheart, what are you feeling right now? Oh, I can see that you're feeling. So that you're holding yourself from the part of you that might meditate. And you're holding with great tenderness all of the vulnerable human experience. I'm feeling overwhelming rage. What else are you feeling? I'm feeling despair. And if it's really overwhelming, one of my favorite things to do is that Tonglen experience. It's a Buddhist practice where you say, okay, let me just breathe in heartbreak. I'm lovesick, right? So I'm going to breathe in lovesick, and I'm going to breathe out a blessing to all human beings in the world who are also suffering with this feeling of being lovesick right now, who are separated from people that they love and who feel hopeless and in despair about that. And the moment you do that, now you're joining the human race in a way that allows you to soften into compassion and into greater love. And then you just soften into your own humanity. But it takes the war impulse out of it. And at that point, you can then say, what's waking up? What's waking up inside of this? And that's where you begin to say, what's waking up is the recognition that I can't love enough for 2 people, that I need to have mutual love, and that my, fantasies, I could rescue someone, or I could just settle for whatever addiction they were with, or however I was compromising myself, doesn't work. And so then I get to set an intention. This is all step 1. This is how we work with the internal, right? I'm going to set an intention to have healthier love on the other side of this, right? So then step 2, we go into that tendency to blame and shame ourselves or others. And I call it reclaiming your power or your life. Your power and your life. And it's really about seeing our part in a way that liberates us to never make that same mistake again. So I say, even if it's 97% the other person's fault, what's my 3%? What's my 3%? And that's really where we get to see the high cost of doing things like overgiving to try and prove your value, or skipping over the red flags, or dismissing your deeper knowing. All those kind of subtle things that we do to borrow against ourselves that end up costing us big time, and that are really unhealthy. And that when you engage them, you're not creating health, and there's a consequence to it. So then we commit to doing it differently moving forward.
One thing that I really benefited from in my own conscious uncoupling process is going through it with a group. I
Wow.
really commend your programs, because when I was in the thick of a divorce, where you just there are days where you're just sort of laying on the floor, right? Like, you're in this process, and life doesn't look like it's ever going to get beyond the darkness that you can see in front of you in that moment. And one thing that really helped, and I'm sure you hear this all the time, is we were in a group of about 100 and everybody was going through the same thing. And so I didn't feel so alone in the process. And so I'll just also share, as somebody if anybody's going through a significant breakup right now, you had mentioned the source fracture. And I really found benefit in that teaching as well, because when you realize, oh, okay, I've got this thing and I'm placing this meaning on my partner, you realize that you're looking for ways to put that meaning on things even when they didn't intend to draw that out of you. It's just there. And so you start to take ownership of that and realize, okay, I know that I need to be someone who can take accountability for their things, own my part of the breakup, and own what it is to move on with grace. And so I really found benefit in the inner bonding work of Margaret Paul. I don't know if I'm sure maybe you know that as well. I combined that with lesson 109 in the course, I rest in God. And so in inner bonding work, it sounds like the corniest thing in the world, but you sort of put your hand over your own heart and you say, I will love you now. Like, I'm the one who will love you now. And so I found real tremendous benefit in that, and combining I will love you now with the turning the I into God, right? So God will love me now, and I can rest in God, and I know that will, as the lesson says, wake the sleeping truth in me, and I'll be able to see beyond appearances to the truth in everyone and everything. And so through that process, I found actually a way to what I called love in such a way that was bigger than anything that came and went in my life. And that was the process for me that you helped me through, was to find a way to love bigger than anything in my life that came and went. And so I just
That's beautiful.
yeah, I want to
That's really
empower you for that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
So
you.
obviously you had mentioned the language of conscious uncoupling had a breakout moment in the ending of the relationship between Gwyneth Paltrow and Chris Martin. This was around 2015. Gwyneth Paltrow wrote an essay for British Vogue in the fall of 2020, so 5 years later, and it was billed as conscious uncoupling has permeated breakup culture. Gwyneth looks back on what British Vogue called a separation revolution. And Katherine, there was the last paragraph of that essay really caught my attention, because Gwyneth spoke of not only going through the breakup in a harmonious way, but staying devoted to your partner in what I think is a new way for our culture as well. And I want to read just a bit of the ending of that essay for those who are here, and so you can hear it again as well, because I'm sure you've read this too. But she says, "You loved your ex once, and you probably still do. So keep those great qualities of theirs close to your heart," which leads me to the final and potentially most radical point. It's okay to stay in love with the parts of your ex that you were always in love with. In fact, that's what makes conscious uncoupling work. Love all of those wonderful parts of them. They still exist. They can still make you feel the way you felt for that person. Rather than shutting them out, lean into the unfamiliarity of those feelings and explore them. We all lose the nuance of life when we make it all good or all bad. Conscious uncoupling lets us recognize those two different loves can coexist and even nourish each other. And I'm wondering what you think about this, and whether you see this as the next step in conscious uncoupling, where you're not only separating with love, but you're still in relationship with that person with love. What do you think about that?
Well, I think I hadn't read that.
Oh, how do you?
And no, it's lovely to hear what she had to say about it. No, I think that it depends on where someone is, truthfully. First of all, Gwyneth has two beautiful children with Chris, so they have a reason to stay a family. And so we talk in conscious uncoupling about creating structures to be a happily even after family or happy post-divorce family. So that's, lovely. And she's a very expanded consciousness. For some people, I think that might be tricky for them to do what she's talking about truthfully. I think for some people, just the neutrality where you're at peace with someone. So for me, peace is the goal.
Mm-hmm.
You have closure. You're consciously, you've consciously closed that chapter, but not like a severing,
Mm-hmm.
where you've really just completed something and you've grown through the experience. So you can look back and be grateful, even if you were deeply hurt or deeply disappointed, or even if there were consequences. I mean, I don't know that some people who are going through separations have had very, very difficult roads. They've had people steal money from them. They've had people do sociopathic kind of things, or try and take their children away because they've lied. There's all sorts of things that happen. So you have to almost, it's not like one size fits all. So she's speaking to a very ideal situation where no sociopathic behavior has happened.
Mm-hmm.
They've both behaved pretty well, and I think that then becomes possible, where you're just expanding.
Yeah. I was thinking this absolutely has to be something that evolves between two former partners who are incredibly mature. And then you also have to have a real maturity in the new partners that come in, who, traditionally we don't tend to look so favorably on our partners who have close relationships with their ex. But could we get there, right? Could we get to a place where that's the ideal? So it's not just we want to go through the breakup in a loving way, but we want to still retain some sense of devotion, would be the word that the course would use, but that might be too strong for just regular parlance, but still some kind of connection with that person, so that it's not a complete break in the relationship.
Yeah, I mean, if people behave well, then that's possible. If people strive, it's not that they don't make mistakes or they don't mess up sometimes, but there's a difference between breaking up with someone who really does cross the line,
Mm-hmm.
and does something, really kind of wrong.
Yeah.
They've lied, they've stolen, they've ruined your reputation, they've really harmed you in some way. So in that case, we're getting to forgiveness, forgiving ourselves for kind of playing along, for not speaking up, for not intervening on our own behalf sooner, for not negotiating better for our needs. And we have to take responsibility. I have a lot of people who say, well, I'm getting divorced now from a person who's very narcissistic and I've got children. And I say, well, so now there's being responsible for what it looks like when you create babies with a person who's immature in that way. And now that's what you're going to be dancing with for the next 10 years as you co-raise these children. So, rather than being victimized by that person, just be responsible for that was what you chose. And these are the consequences. There's good and there's bad. You have these beautiful children. And, the difficult part is this. So I just keep people out of victimization, truthfully,
Mm-hmm.
because I think, and in many ways, I see conscious uncoupling almost as the bumpers at the bowling alley. Like when you bring a kid to a bowling alley, they put little bumpers up on the side so nothing goes into the gutter. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like it's so easy to go into the gutter in a breakup. So it's like the bumpers that keep it just going on the, straight and narrow. Why? Because we don't want to create karma. We don't want to get stuck in the anger. We don't want to get stuck in the quicksand of resentment. It will limit your life. Many people go on to live a lesser life in the aftermath of a bad breakup. But a breakup can be a time of a great expansion of wisdom, of depth, of finally reconciling all of those wounded places that you've been bringing into relationship that have created consequences for you. So it can be a great time of growth. And if you can just stay on the straight and narrow, even if you can't feel a possible positive future, to know that there is a possible
Mm-hmm.
positive future, and just stay pointed in that direction and have faith, that's when it goes really, really well. So Gwyneth is great. Gwyneth is almost a little polyamorous in her thinking there, I think. She has kind of a polyamorous consciousness that you can be in love with more than one person and it's okay. I don't know that everybody has access to that. So I wouldn't want that
Well,
just to be the
I know
standard.
I don't, but at all. But at the same time, I do I think there's something really wise about not just breaking up with someone and then leaving them. I mean, particularly leaving them out of your life, particularly when you share children, as you mentioned. And I love the idea that there was something that you loved about this person once, and you can still hold on to that and know that that was true for a time, and then the relationship, the breakup of it goes a bit more easier, and you're able to look at them with more forgiveness if you can see that instead of all the things that they did wrong and all the grievances that you
Absolutely.
hold.
Yeah.
There's a part in the psychotherapy supplement of the course where, and Robert was telling me about this just a minute ago, where it says, I'm paraphrasing here, but the good in your relationship is saved until you both realize that that was the only thing real. And then when that happens, all the good has been saved is returned to you as a sign of God's love. Now, obviously, all of this isn't happening like immediately in our physical presence, but at the same time, I love the idea that on the level of spirit, everything that was real, the love that was real about that relationship is not only saved for both of you, but given back to you at some point when you realize that was the only thing that was true. So,
Yeah.
okay.
Well, I will say it feels really good. I mean, Mark, who is my first husband, he's still a dear friend. I still love Mark. And he recoupled. We're both recoupled. And we exchange Christmas gifts. And our daughter's in college now, so we still have family meetings. You know, he's extended family for me. And I would do anything for Mark. If he needed a kidney, I would hope he would call me.
Didn't you live in the same building on different
Yeah, yeah.
floors where your daughter could just go up and down the elevator?
Yeah, I mean, that's step 5 in conscious uncoupling, has to do with creating new agreements and setting up structures so that life is fluid and is working for everyone, and really look for those win-win structures. Because I love what you're saying, because when children, even in amicable divorce where people are polite to each other, if they're disconnected emotionally, and then you're passing a child back and forth between homes, what you're essentially doing is you're telling that child you have to lose one home to go into the other home. So there's a way that we create emotional homelessness for children when we do that. So I'm really for, be together, work it through, get to the other side. Don't make your children do the work for you, because, children keep the places where they're not well, they don't articulate it for us. They don't come out and say, look, I think I need to go see, a grief counselor because I'm really not doing well in maths because I'm so distracted by how, toxic it is that you're divorced. They're just gonna, bury down somewhere, watch their video games or whatever they do to try and cope and survive it. So if the kids are not going to tell you, just assume that they're not going to do well if you're not doing well. And so you have to do your own work. If you have resentment and hatred towards the other person, if they have hatred towards you, one of the things we do in conscious uncoupling is I talk about gestures of repair, and just gestures of generosity that disarm anger, that kind of de-escalate tensions in a way that creates a more friendly feeling. So even if that might not be genuine for you, it might be genuine for you as a mother or as a father to do that, so that your children can be raised in a happy home. I will say that Mark and I, when we decided to get divorced, thank God, we sat down and we just said, okay, we're going to join together on a shared intention that our daughter have a happy childhood. So how are we going to do that from this perspective, from inside of this commitment? How are we going to get divorced? So that was our guiding, our North Star our guiding intention.
I've heard that what ensures a child gets through the divorce of their parents relatively unscathed is the relationship that the parents have. And so
Yes.
the way in which the parents relate to each other really does affect the child. And as the child of divorced parents, I didn't even realize until I was an adult all the ways that their breakup had affected how I am in relationship. And so the more that we can avoid those kinds of situations for our own children, the better. And to think that it boils down to the relationship that the parents have really puts it all into a more significant picture. And I love the agreement that you had with Mark, in the context of how are we going to create a healthy childhood for our daughter, how will we behave? And so anyway, I want to, I know we're kind of running out of time here, but I want to shift over into calling in the one.
Great.
As I mentioned before, what I really like about your work is that you're advocating a new way of being, and no more. That's evident in the very memorable moment that you shared with a friend when you told her that you wanted to get married and you hadn't even found the guy. So, can you tell us what your friend said to you in that moment that kickstarted this book?
Absolutely. Well, I was, I think I shared before, I've done a lot of spiritual and personal development work over the years, but as well as I got, as healed as I became, I did overcome the eating disorder and all sorts of things. I still had the residue of old patterns showing up. And mostly for me, that was unavailable men. So any size, shape, or form, really, married men, men who were
Gay men.
alcoholics, gay men who wanted to explore. I mean, it was just like in one impossible situation after the other. And I felt kind of confused and sad, and I didn't know what was wrong with me, and I didn't know why I couldn't. And I was at this time, I had become a therapist really from the inside out. And at this point, I was helping people to have good relationships and coming home to an empty apartment with my kitty cat Clover there, and it felt very unfair. And I felt sorry for myself sometimes, and I felt just really deeply sad about it. But I was fortunately, this is back in the 90s when we were really just learning about intentions, setting intentions. And I had a group of friends, and we were all kind of holding intentions with and for each other. So we were doing it together. And on the tail end of another disastrous love affair with a man who was not at all available, I called her and I said, Naomi, I'm going to set an intention to be engaged by my 42nd birthday, which was 8 months out. And I had no prospects at all for a husband. I'd only been trying to do this for 20 years because I'd never been married by that point. And she said to me, Katherine, I'm going to hold that intention with you and for you if you give me permission to hold you accountable for being the woman you would need to be in order for that to happen. And that really was the beginning of calling in the one. Because instead of running out to find love, I put my focus on becoming who I'd need to be in order for that to happen.
I love that idea. And that to me is what attracts me to your work the most strongly. Again, it's not like I know you have steps and you have a process, but at the same time, at the end of the day, the process is serving this idea that we have to become the people that are able to move through these significant life changes with grace and call in new relationships with love. And you mentioned just a minute ago, and I want to highlight this because it was so big for me when I was going through my divorce, was um, if I don't forgive and if I don't release these grievances that I hold, then I'm going to not only live a smaller life, but I'm going to be pushing love out of my life. And so it's a good friend who says to you, okay, I'll hold that intention with you, but I want to hold you accountable for being the woman that you need to be in order to make that happen. And so I find that to be very, very inspiring. Go ahead.
Well, basically what she did is she yanked me out of victimization because I had to take responsibility for myself as the source. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that, victimization doesn't always look like a big dramatic, I'm a victim. It looks like there's no good men in my city, or
Mm-hmm.
all the good ones are taken, meaning I'm powerless against what's so. It even looks like this is where it gets really covert for those of us who do our inner work. Well, I'm only this way because my father was this way. And this is what my mother did to me or my father did to me. So, for example, a woman who I worked with once who was saying, I can't stand up for myself with men because my father used to scream at us and hit us when we would talk back and stand up to him. So I said to her, try on the word I won't, as in, I won't stand up for myself because I lack the courage to risk that somebody might be mad at me if I do. So that's the adult now who can take responsibility for ourselves as the source of our experience. Because if you're not standing up for yourself, you're going to create a certain dynamic. The reason why I talk about taking responsibility for our part, 97% the other person, 3% mine, is because if I see my part, like, oh, I get it. I don't stand up for myself. I don't speak up. I don't negotiate my needs. I disappear myself or whatever I do. Until I own that, I can be counted on to do it again. That's why I can't trust myself to open up to love
Mm-hmm.
in the future, and I'll kill it off. I'll kill off the opportunities that might be present for it.
So, those of us who are in the spiritual space obviously believe in God's plan, right? God has a plan for our life, and so how do you find the balance between setting the intention for whatever it is, calling in love, and surrendering to God's will in your life? How do you do that?
I think that that is always an important question to look at because we're not manipulating the universe, but we are awakening to our power to determine the choices that we have and to be responsible for what it is that we are co-creating. One of the reasons I forever teach about doing this in our own lives is because ultimately I want us all to be able to do this in our world, where we're able to stand for a world that works for everyone, where we're able to take stands for the end of war, the creation of a Department of Peace, for the many things that we want to create in our world. And most of us have an undeveloped relationship with how much power we actually have to generate a future that's not going to happen unless we claim it as so. So, most of what we're calling God's will sometimes is just kind of the default repetition of what we're creating from our own unconscious patterns because we haven't really owned ourselves as the source of how we're perpetuating them. So there's always has to be reverence for a higher intelligence of what's unfolding. I mean, we are people of faith. And at the end of the day, we've all had our Job moments where nothing is going the way that we want. And we choose to bless God and be a force for good anyway. We wake up in the morning, we say our prayer, please use me, God. What can I do? Who can I do? What can I say? Who can I say it to serve the greater goodness? And we're going to do that as a form of surrender. But sometimes, even people, if you come in and you have some astrological chart, let's say, and in your chart you have no love or you have, disruptions, I say, well, you and God chose the moment of your birth together, you as this eternal spirit. And truthfully, there was nothing more sacred about you before you incarnated than you now. And if you'd like to change your mind for good reason, then you can change your mind and you can declare something else. But you have to then begin to align your identity with the future that you're standing for. I think it delights the universe that we stop being so passive in the face of what's so and start waking up our God-given power to say what shall be. and what we're a stand for. One of my favorite metaphysicians, Neville Goddard, I have this right on my desk, so I'm going to look at it here. You are free to choose the concept you will accept of yourself. Therefore, you possess the power of intervention, the power which enables you to alter the course of your future. So I believe it's in life's best interest right now to have us all start to wake up to the power that we are holding. Ultimately, at the end of the day, Emily, we surrender to life being beautiful and good, whether or not we're getting what we want. This isn't just about us being whiny babies, demanding what I want when I want it, but it is about us waking up to how much power and influence we have on a future that is not fixed, that
Mm-hmm.
is open to our influence and living with our whole heart in that direction.
Yeah, I think we have more influence and ability to change the course of our life than we think. And one thing that I will just share through my own process with the conscious uncoupling and calling in the one is that I didn't really buy into the concept that I could do something by a date. I would never have the gumption to say in 8 months I'm going to be married, and I hadn't even met the man yet. But at the same time, what really did help me was trying to figure out how I could go through each moment in the most egoless way possible. And that I wanted to be, this is from Conscious Uncoupling, but it's from a poem, it's not your words, but it's the this beautiful line, the grace of a woman and not the grief of a child.
Mhm.
And so I knew that I wanted to, the intention that I did set is I want to be a woman on the other side of this instead of the child that I was when I went into this. And so I got in the middle of the heartbreak, I actually got a little excited about the idea that I could use this heartbreak to emerge different on the other end. And
Wow.
so what I wanted to do, and Marianne Williamson said this. She was like, when I asked her something about purpose, she was like, "What is purpose?" She was like, "Your only purpose is to show up in each moment with integrity." And I was like, okay, that makes a lot of sense to me. My only plan is to be in this moment in love and integrity. And then it's like Alcoholics Anonymous, right? Like 1 minute at a time, the next minute, and then the next minute, and the next minute. And then one day you look around and it's like, oh, I have a different life. And it's because I showed up differently. And it's not just differently like I wanted this thing, and so I went out in the world and I grabbed it. It's I showed up with love. I tried to make an egoless choice in this moment, and that made me someone other people wanted to be around. And that's how I called in the one, right?
That's beautiful.
Yeah. So I know we are running out of time here, but I'll just ask you before we go. I
Yeah.
know that there are a lot of folks who are listening who may be single, and they're like, okay, well, where do I start with this process? I want to call in the one, but I don't know what to do. So what would you say to them?
Well, I always like starting from the future. I think a lot of us do our healing work only from the past, which is great, but there's a difference between healing your life and transforming your life. So I like to say healing is the domain of the past, but transformation is the domain of the future. So you want to start where you want to end up, and you want to have the courage to declare that future. So whether or not you do it from a timeline, and I appreciate your perspective, I will say that the value of a timeline is not so much you're going to force the hand of the universe, but it's almost like if you say, one day I'm going to run a marathon, it's really different than saying, in 90 days, I'm going to run a marathon. Because the moment you say, in 90 days, I have to put the cookie down now and I have to go out and start, walking or running around my neighborhood today, right now, get my sneakers on. So it puts that urgency into the space for people. But, however you declare that future, to recognize the difference between wanting something and intending it. Because the moment you say, my intention is, you suddenly become accountable for showing up with integrity in a way that is generative of that future. So that your fidelity really is to becoming who you need to be. In order for that to happen, that's going to be initiate profound shedding and letting go of relationships that are inconsistent, ways of relating to yourself that are inconsistent, that future. All the hopes for the ex-boyfriend, one thing at a time, you have to let it go. The other thing it initiates is the ways you need to now grow yourself. I better learn about healthy boundaries. I have to learn how to express my needs in a way that's healthy. I need to know the difference between unhealthy needs and healthy needs. What am I going to need to know in order for it to go well when I do have that partner in my life? So that would be my deepest desire for you, is that out of this conversation, a new possibility opens up for your future, fulfilled in a way that would really light your heart up.
Mm. Well, Katherine, thank you so much for your time, for being with us today. I said that I wasn't going to share too much about my own journey because I just felt like I couldn't get through it without like some kind of breakdown, because it really is. I mean, you deal with people in the most vulnerable parts of their life. And when I was going through that, I have to tell you, and I'm sure you again hear this all the time, but it was a lifeline to me, the work that you do. I went through the Conscious Uncoupling program. I got a coach who worked with me one-on-one. I listened to the audios from the program every morning on my way to pick up my children, and it was a bridge for
Oh,
me.
I'm so grateful.
I had the course and I practiced every single day. A lesson 109 was a big one. I went through a real process with that. But I really sincerely appreciate the work that you do and the way in which you are calling us to new ways of being. And I do believe that it is creating more healing in the world, because if we can break up with love, then we are breaking up in a new way, and we can carry that forward and cause less damage to ourselves and our children. So thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you, Emily. Thanks for having me on. So much love
Um,
to everyone.
and if someone wants to find you, where would they go?
Well, you can always just go to katherinewoodwardthomas.com. If you'd like to be a part of our community, we do a lot of free calls. We have wonderful courses and coach trainings and stuff, but you can just sign up for the Love Out Loud list, and once a week I send out teachings.
All right. Thank you once again. Bye for
Thank
now.
you.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for
Bye,
joining us.
everyone.